much, Eric. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak. I sometimes ask why I called this book "Why Capitalists Need Communists." What's that kind of provocative title as it is. And some of you may have read an article in the Financial Times on Friday, which described how the chief executive of Siemens, the German engineering company, had invited a 23-year-old climate protester to join the board of Siemens. And he said the reason was that Siemens needed to respond more actively to the climate crisis and that it needed to be shaken up, and therefore he wanted to bring on board, onto the board, this protester. And if what he says is true, it's a perfect example of the phenomenon I was referring to in the title of the book, Why Capitalists Need Communists. Because there are quite a few capitalists, people running the system, who are aware that the system is broken and that it needs changing. But they find it very difficult themselves to change the system. And the only way they can change the system, I argue, is by forming an alliance with protesters, with outsiders, with people such as this climate protester who has been invited onto the board of Siemens. Forming alliances, so the outsiders will provide the energy and drive for change, while the insiders, the chief executive, will provide the know-how, the knowledge of where the levers are. And actually, people sometimes raise their eyebrows at this, but if you think about what happened in the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the communists took over, they didn't simply shoot all the capitalists and all the people running the system. Many of them were kept on, but they had a people's commissar sitting next to them and looking over their shoulder. In that case, it was very much the communists needed the capitalists, but they needed to work together in order to, they recognised that they needed to work together in order to make the new system work. So both sides have got something to contribute. Anyway, so that's why I called this book what I called it. In this talk, I want rather quickly to go through basically four things. First of all, I want to make the case that the big problems we face require big change. It's not just tweaking the system isn't going to work, and I'll explain why I think that. But big change doesn't always happen. Big change is difficult to bring about. So the second thing I want to argue is that some of the conditions for this change already exist. Not all of them, but some of them. We are in a crisis of some kind. The third thing I'd argue is that something that doesn't exist, something we don't have, one of the conditions that doesn't exist is a strong public morality that will help, or a foundation for the changes, for the political programme. And that in order to get that strong political morality, we need to dispense with utilitarianism. And finally, I'll revert to the point that capitalists and communists need to collaborate. So, I think I won't get into this in detail. I think we're all very familiar with these big five problems. There are others, but these are the big five problems that everyone knows about: climate change, inequality, housing, pressure on public services, and the promise and threat of automation. It could be a wonderful thing, but some people have predicted that 40% of existing jobs will be made redundant. So that's quite a lot of job creation that's going to be needed. It is going to turn into something good rather than bad. So, so first of all, why solving these? I want to talk about why solving these problems is not a matter of tweaking. I mean, in a sense, it's obvious. Problems of this scale are obviously not going to be solved by small changes, but nonetheless, the mentality of most of the public debate sort of doesn't really take this on board. I mean, if you think about what changes required to do with climate change are, we'll eventually have to replace the entire gas network, the heating systems that people have got across the entire country. We've got to re-engineer industrial processes so that they're carbon neutral. Think about reversing inequality. We've got to reverse very well long-established trends that have driven down wages in the lower half of the income distribution. If you think about reversing long-standing trends in the housing market, think about raising the taxes needed to pay for public services to levels that we haven't seen since the 1940s. So all the, and then to create 40% of jobs, new jobs. All these things are obviously very big problems, very big actions, and small tweaks just aren't going to cut it. And yet, when you read the paper, when you hear politicians talk, for the most part, you get the sense that people haven't quite woken up to the scale of the changes and actions that are going to be needed. So, the reliance I just sort of, because this is an economics group, I just sort of made a small reference to the price mechanism, because the price mechanism is something people like to talk about, and they say, well, if we just price it, we introduce some regulations, then things will start to work better. But the problem, of course, with price mechanism is that you change one price, it interacts with lots of other changes. It's completely unpredictable. So what the impacts of price changes are going to be over the long term. There's too much complexity. And therefore, if you actually want to reduce the uncertainty that you're faced with, you can't rely upon simply manipulating prices. You actually have to go back to a form of planning and And I would like to I'd like to read this quote from a former Prime Minister. Do we or do we not set out to control the basic pattern of events, to direct development, to plan growth, to use the instruments of government to influence or determine private decisions? Believe that this is inevitable. Forces at work now too complicated, risk of setback too great to leave to market forces and laissez-faire dirigisme, but it must be creative dirigisme. This was written by Harold Macmillan in 1962. When I sort of say planning, people think, oh my God, talking about state socialism and Soviet system and so on. But in the 1960s, the Tory Prime Minister argued that planning was going to be an essential part of the process. And I'm arguing that as well. Planning, given the uncertainties and given the complexities and the scale of the problem, is absolutely essential. And if you think about it, we all plan our lives, and any decent company plans its operations and strategies for the years ahead. So why shouldn't a country do the same? Now, the planning I'm talking about is not the old-fashioned state plan. It's not the old-fashioned state planning that was favoured by the Soviet Union, of course, and nor indeed is it the kind of planning that Macmillan might have had in mind in 1962 or that took place in Britain in the 1940s and 50s. We have finest deference for the gentlemen in Whitehall in their best than we did in those days. The problems are more complex, and we live in a much more flatter society. And therefore, we're going to have a much more participative form of planning than we had in those days. And fortunately, the techniques for engaging people in the planning process have been developed and are being developed. Various forms of deliberative democracy are being worked on and are being practiced. So the tools are there for a very different kind of planning. But in addition, not only do we need to engage the public in this way, but business itself needs to be part of the planning process in a very active way. And this was done to some extent in the post-war period, so-called indicative planning. Business needs to form an active partnership with government, because it's not a question of government saying you mustn't do this. It's a question of government and business working together to do things actively. And that requires business to have an active role and not simply a passive one. Now, some business people believe that this is where business should go, and this is a quote from a leading business person. Business could serve the needs of citizens and communities with the same vigour with which it has served the needs of shareholders over the years. And this is Paul Polman, who used to be chief executive of Unilever. Now, he's not absolutely, he's mainstream position, but his opinion is not absolutely mainstream. But it is at least a sign that some people in business do see this as a positive, as the way forward. There's a lot of humbug. A lot of people say these things without meaning it, but I believe, from what I can tell, that Paul Polman did mean it. We'll have to see whether the chief executive of Siemens really values this new board member. But the problem is that at the moment, the relationship between business and government is not good. Most businesses do not form this kind of relationship. When I was researching the book, people on both sides of the divide said the relationship was worse than it's been in the 80s and 90s. It was actually a very, very poor quality of relationship. And therefore, the partnership that I've been talking about, it's not going to happen. There are a few little kind of fringe things that happen, but sort of socially responsible activities that some businesses engage in. But serious mainstream sharing of objectives between government and business is not at the moment common practice. So we need to change things. We need to change things. That raises the question: is this possible? In order to make it possible, there will have to be some changes to law, legislation, changes to the way the investment industry works and the incentives it creates for businesses, so that they're incentivized to behave in a more cooperative way with government to form these partnerships. But that's not what I'm going to talk about, because that, in a sense, is relatively feasible if the will is there, and I'm doing some work on that. Relatively feasible if the will is there. The real question is the will there? Can this actually come about? Now, up until December up until the beginning of November, I thought that that eventually Labour would get into power, and this could be one way forward in the current, in the immediate future. But of course, that didn't happen. And so I'm somewhat agnostic at the moment. I haven't really sort of revised my position in a fully coherent way as to how to respond to the fact that Labour did so devastatingly. But I do believe that bringing about this partnership is a vital role for politicians. Politicians have to work hard to bring about the partnership that's needed between business and government. And I believe that perhaps Labour will be in a much better place for doing that in a few months' time than it was a few months ago. So the election result has at least driven Labour to a point where it may be able to help form that kind of partnership. What the Conservative government will do, I don't know, and if anyone knows, then that's great. But there are some signs that it too may want to, once the whole Brexit thing has been dealt with, it too may want to move a little bit in that direction. But that's the kind of political surface. Underneath the political surface, there has to be a coming together of minds and of aspirations and ideas. And it's at that level that I want to focus, because without that those sort of more fundamental changes, the political changes will be trivial, and they're going to actually drive real change. And so my argument is that there is an opportunity for a counter-elite, and for the kind of radical change that such elites have brought about in the past. By counter-elite, I mean precisely when some disaffected members of the incumbent elite abandon their role, not abandon their role in the elite, but abandon their loyalty to the elite and join forces with outsiders to drive change, because they feel that the current system is not working. They want to keep on running the system, but they think that they want to run a system that works, and therefore they feel the need to drive change. They bring in outsiders, and then that helps bring about change. And there are four conditions in which this, my sort of quick review of the history, which I do in the book, suggests have to apply. First of all, there has to be crisis and failure of the system, the existing system. This has to lead to discontent within the elite. Then some of the elite to go over to the other side. And this process has to give rise to some very strong ideas that underpin a burning confidence that the world can be made a better place, that we're not simply drifting into disaster. So, crisis and failure. So let's look at some historical examples. Crisis and failure of the system. That look at the French Revolution, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution. You can see that clearly, in all those periods of major change, it was obviously crisis and failure of the system. Then there was discontent within the elite, and some of them went over to the other side. This is a picture of Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was Louis XVI's cousin, and he went over to the other side. He was known as Philippe Égalité, and he voted for the beheading of his cousin, which of course happened. So he really did go over to the other side. And then a bit later, he lost his own head. So that's not a great example in some ways, because that's what happens. But it is a very vivid example of a member of the elite who joined forces with the sans-culottes and abandoned his class loyalty. And there were others too. I mean, other aristocrats, Lafayette and Mirabeau and others like that. And there are some nice quotes. Sorry, there's a nice quote I'd like to read you. There was a man called Canoncier who was a priest, so one of these rather suave aristocratic priests who was an habitué of the salon, and he was commissioned by a think tank, sort of 18th century think tank, funded entirely by aristocrats, to write a pamphlet. And in this pamphlet he denounced privilege as parasitic and divisive. And he wrote about the aristocracy as a caste of idle, burdensome usurpers. So I sometimes think, as someone who works for a modern think tank, what our funders would say if we wrote that about them. Anyway, I don't know if you can call it. After the Russian Revolution, there was other examples like this. There was a man called Protopopov, who had been a Tsarist minister, and he recalled how even the very highest social classes became frondeurs before the revolution, that is, revolutionists before the revolution. In grand salons and clubs, the policy of the government received harsh and unfriendly criticism. So there was this discontent, and as I say, some went over to the other side, and the elite split. And I think this is very different, obviously, from the way the elite normally operates. Some of you may have read C. Wright Mills's book about the power elite in America in the 1950s, and how this group of people, whether they were business people or judges or military politicians, they came here and they were loyal to each other. And as he puts it, there is no class consciousness so strong as the class consciousness of the elite. And that's the source of their power, because they look after each other. Whereas those outside the elite are fragmented and divided, and so they don't have any power. So, when the elite fragments, then this inequality between the power of the elite and the powerlessness of everybody else is reduced, is weakened, and that creates an opportunity for change. And then this opportunity, this fragmentation, and this joining forces with the outsiders gives rise to, or perhaps is caused by, difficult to say, burning confidence in the future. In the 17th century, it was about God and the Puritan ideas around that, and grace. In the 18th century, the 18th century revolution was about the rights of man. In the Russian Revolution, it was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in 1945, when Labour, which is obviously not a revolutionary situation, but there was a similar burning confidence. And this poster, which I really like, is the election poster for Labour in 1945, and it captures that sense that, yes, we can do anything. And there's another quote which I'd like to read, which was a young man who had about 20, just wrote a letter to his friend, he hadn't really, just about what was going on. And he wrote the following: "We've shown in this war," 1945, "we've shown in this war that we British don't always muddle through. We've shown we can organise superbly. No excuse anymore for unemployment and slums and underfeeding. Using even half the vision and energy and invention and pulling together we've done in the war, and what is there we cannot do?" And that, I think, captures the spirit of confidence that existed at that time. And it wasn't just young people, it spread throughout the Mandarin class, the senior civil servants, and of course the politicians. And when you read about this, you just get this unbelievable sense Everybody thought that if sensible people of goodwill got together, there wasn't any problem that they couldn't solve. And that's so different from the way we are now, I'm afraid. And there, you may say these are sort of extreme examples, revolutions after war, but I think if you look at post-war British history, you see similar moments when things look really grim, and then suddenly there's an upsurge and a changeover of people and ideas. So in the early 60s, there was incredible gloom in the country. Someone wrote a book called Suicide of the Nation, and somebody else wrote a book called Stagnant Society. And everyone thought the establishment was leading the country to the dogs. Decay. There was a dreadful sense of things going wrong. But then suddenly, in 1964, we had the Wilson winning the election, the white heat of technology, we had the Beatles, we had the World Cup, we had all those changes that Roy Jenkins introduced, and hey, what's not to like? And the old establishment was swept away, and a new group of people came into power. So you had this sort of bounce out of gloom and a changeover, and if you like, a sort of counter-elite emerged with a new set of ideas. And then in 1979, something rather similar happened. You had the gloom, you had the winter of discontent, you had the IMF loan, and then whatever you may think of Margaret Thatcher, whether you like her or you don't like her, it's undeniable that she brought this amazing burst of energy and confidence, swept away many of the members of the old establishment, and introduced new people into power. So it does happen, even not in revolutionary situations and not after world wars. So the question is, could we be, perhaps not at this precise moment, but soon, could we be at the brink of such a changeover? And I just want to go through some of the conditions that I described from historical examples. Is there crisis and failure of the system? Yes. And also, often you see in historical examples that crisis and failure of the system goes on and on and on for years. So the fact that it's not suddenly, it hasn't changed yet, doesn't mean that we won't get change soon. Secondly, is there discontent within the elite? Yes. And I want to read some quotes because these are quite striking. I talked to quite a few capitalists and quite a few communists. And the capitalists I spoke to were, it was a skewed sample, but the capitalists I spoke to were, if anything, more discontent with the system, or expressed their discontent with the system more volubly than the communists. And here are some quotes from, these are fund managers, executives, senior management consultants, that kind of person. My colleagues know that shareholder capitalism is broken. My clients realise the current system is not working. The system we have is genuinely corrupt. Capitalism has lost its way. Capitalism imposes a tremendous cost on our planet and its most vulnerable people. The story most people in the city have in the back of their mind is that you have to lie, steal, or cheat to be successful. Capitalism has been hijacked by the management class. So, clearly, there is discontent within a portion of the elite. It's only ever going to be a portion. Clearly, there is discontent. And so, when I'm talking about the role of politicians, the role of politicians is to mobilise that discontent, channel it, and link it up with the discontent of the outsiders. Which goes on to the third question. Are some of the elite going over to the other side? No, they're not really. There are a few little signs. I came across a pension fund manager, pension fund asset manager, who'd given up his job to go and work for Extinction Rebellions. This is a sort of, in a minor way, going over to the other side. There are people in the climate movement, on the sort of inside, who work with people on the outside. But I have to say, it's only sort of at the fringes, at the margins. But it's happening a bit, and it could happen more. And as I say, I believe that's one of the roles of politicians. Is there a strong idea underpinning burning confidence? No, clearly not. If anyone thinks there is, I'd be delighted, because I don't see that. I see a sort of general sense of gloom. And as you to say, given the previous examples, that we're doomed to gloom forever. It just means that we haven't yet had an upsurge. So I wanted to talk now for another 5 minutes or so about where I think, I'm not going to present the strong idea that will underpin burning confidence, I'm afraid, but I am going to talk about what I think needs to underpin it, the moral foundations that I think could form the basis for some strong new public idea. This is a picture of Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, as it happens, born almost exactly the same time as Louis Philippe in the mid-18th century. Benthamism, the moral philosophy that he developed, is basically, in my view, a big part of the problem. Some of you will know, probably maybe all of you will know, what his basic proposition is. So, to pursue the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and he defines good, he defines this in terms of maximising pleasure and minimising pain. And utility consists of, and out of that concept you have utility. The basic point is maximise pleasure and minimise pain for everybody, and then you're doing well. And this has underpinned the development of neoclassical economics in the 19th century, which could be seen in some ways as a part of a theory of how you maximise pleasure and minimise pain, and indeed modern policy. The Treasury Green Book, the whole way in which government considers costs and benefits, and what it should do, very rooted in Benthamism. And I believe it's a problem, because it makes the quality of individual experience the measure of value. So, love is valued because of the pleasure it gives you. God is valued because of the pleasure it gives you. Work is valued because of the pleasure it gives you. Everything is valued because of the pleasure it gives you in utilitarianism. And if you talk, sometimes utilitarians just don't get that there's anything wrong with this. They just can't understand it. You could have a different idea. But it is actually, when you think about it, quite a striking idea. You only value your friends because of the pleasure they give you. That's not really how many people feel about life. But I think it's potentially quite damaging. And it encourages, and turning now to how that played out in politics, it does encourage a politics of consumption, because the purpose of consumption is often to get pleasure. So consumption is a good, and in economics, consumption is a good. We consider the economy as doing a good job if it delivers effective consumption at the lowest possible input of labour. And that is totally consistent with the utilitarian framework. And as a result of that, it tends to encourage market solutions as opposed to planning and partnership. It doesn't have to, it's not a logical necessity that it encourages market solutions. But in fact, markets are quite a good way of optimising consumption. So there's a sort of extrapolation that goes on, and you end up with just thinking that the default is markets, and as you can identify market failure, that's the standard economic framework. So I don't think that, I sort of was trying to suggest earlier, that we can't solve the big problems if we adopt market solution. We probably can't deal with climate change if we have a politics of consumption. And we probably can't get the kind of partnership working really effectively if we see that individual experience is the measure of that. Fortunately, there is an alternative. There are other moral systems which are quite familiar to many people, which make the quality of relationships the measure of value rather than the quality of experience. Those relationships, maybe with friends and family, community, work, or relationship with work, something that Marx in particular is very sort of keen on, and the Pope has also talked about, previous popes perhaps have talked about, and nature, and if you're religious, God. We person with good relationships in the sort of scheme that I refer to in my title of my book, called Flourishing. Person with good relationships flourishes, so that's the term that's sometimes used. I think that when I say this, I don't think I'm saying anything that anyone here will think is odd, actually. I think it's in line with people's intuitions, and it's part of a long tradition of what morality, which goes back at least to Aristotle, but at least to Aristotle possibly. I don't know. So, think that this can form the basis for social partnership, in the way that utilitarianism forms the basis for markets. And there's an aside here that relationships are the basis for your life chances. Your life chances are critically dependent upon the relationships you have with your family, with your teachers, with your community, with your workplace, and so on and so forth. So a politics that focuses on relationships is also going to be a politics that focuses on life chances. And I think that is this brings it back, if you like, to the sort of the stuff of daily politics, which perhaps just talking about relationships doesn't. Therefore, I think this could form the foundation for a political programme to look at climate change, the other problems I mentioned, and that focuses on life chances. But I still quickly want to say that capitalists need communists. Capitalists know the levers. They kind of want to pull them, but they don't get round to it. Communists don't know the levers, but they have the energy to make the capitalists act. So they need to work together on the public morality and the ideas. The public morality of the kind I was describing may not be quite that, but something like that, and the strong ideas flowing from it. Then policies on planning, redistribution, and so on and so forth, and then changes to the structures, which I alluded to briefly. So that is why I think that capitalists need communists. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. That gives a lot to get into for Polly Mackenzie, who is the Chief Executive of DMOT. She started out as a business journalist and then got involved with the political system quite deeply, I think, with being Director of Policy for Nick Clegg during the coalition years, even helping draft the coalition agreement. She's also, since then, also got into finance and mental health, which is another very interesting area, and now the Chief Executive of DMOS. So a political, grounded view. I'm not saying that you're ungrounded, but a practice of dealing with the political sphere. Polly, what can you say?
Charles is super grounded, and I'm just going to grab my notebook because there's a quote in there. I've got this amazing, because I'm a complete consumption whore, unlike Charles, a Smytheson leather-bound book for Christmas. I mean, pointless indulgence or what, I've no idea. Anyway, so I'm using it as a commonplace book to collect salient quotations. Anyway, so what do I want to talk about? I want to talk about two things, and I like these days to channel Boris Johnson by not preparing or bringing any notes. But it's the extent of the ways in which I'm similar to Boris Johnson. I shan't speak in Latin, and I know exactly how many children I've got. What do I want to talk about? I want to talk about Adam Smith. I haven't actually read any Adam Smith, but I know the title of one of his books, which is about the invisible hand, or it's his concept, right? I obviously need to do your course. I did English literature at university, which means that obviously I go to dinner parties and I talk about Lacan, and that I have no value or role in public life of any kind. I'm going to come on to that. Anyway, so Adam Smith, the invisible hand, and how the invisible hand drives through price mechanisms and a range of other things this benefit to all of us. But looking around the room, I don't think it is disableist or able-bodied normative to point out that we all have, how many hands? Two, right? We've got two hands. So there's this amazing pamphlet written by Demos ages and ages ago, 20 years ago, called The Other Invisible Hand, right? And it recognises that we are absolutely, as Adam Smith recognised, motivated by our direct self-interest and our desire for pleasure. That seems to be something that we've evolved to have, is a sort of heat-seeking desire for pleasure and joy. But we also have this other motivation, which acts as another invisible hand, and that is to be nice. That might be having relationships, it might be compassion or altruism. I have this former colleague called Matthew who believes in God, as is his absolute right, of course. And he and I used to have this argument, because I'm an atheist, about whether there was a God. And he used to say, the reason I believe in God fundamentally is because science can't explain altruism. And the number of times I've put, of course, science can explain altruism, right? We have evolved. It doesn't mean you can't believe in God. It's perfectly fine to believe in God, but you can't I don't think it makes that sense to say I believe in God specifically because science can't explain altruism, right? It's that if you think about, and this is, so the quote is from Paul Collier, who wrote this great piece in, I think, Prospect, explaining that, I didn't even write it down properly. Anyway, the point is, so our selfish genes, right? People have read Richard Dawkins' book, that we have these selfish genes which are just simply aiming to survive and to procreate. And we have evolved to have bodies and motivations and minds that enable those selfish genes to survive. And those selfish genes program us to be altruistic because successful societies are ones which have relationships and have altruism. And where we as humans use both our invisible hands, slightly stretched metaphor, to shape our behaviour. And it seems to me that one of the challenges with economics is that when it tries to understand those other motivations, those other reasons why people do things, and certainly kind of gender studies will tell you that it is both women who do more of the unpaid labour in our society, and also that unpaid labour motivated by things other than cash reward makes up well over half of the things that we do over the course of our lifetimes. We don't sort of try and measure that very well. Sometimes economists will try and sort of translate it into a price, so that you can sort of price in the pleasure or the joy or the altruism or whatever it might be. But because it's quite hard to measure that kind of activity, it's not tracked in the same way. Nobody runs payroll on the amount of hours I spend doing cleaning in my house. It only gets measured by the economists and by the Treasury once it's turned into economic activity and I've outsourced it. And once the Treasury can tax it. It's a strange thing that if I and my neighbour share our childcare responsibilities so that we both do half of it, the Treasury doesn't get its mucky little paws on it. But if I pay her to do half of my childcare and don't get the reciprocal return, it's taxed, it's also regulated quite heavily, even though it's a very similar interaction. My mother has occasionally looked after my children. There's no tax involved in that. As soon as it becomes economic activity, we are able to study it. And it's one of the challenges, I think, for all of us, economic scientists and others, to try and think about how can you measure the shifts in that non-formal labour, informal labour, which we do so much of, which is largely motivated by altruism or by other things that we find it hard to price, like duty and obligation. My mother looked after her mother in her old age, not out of love, because she hated her mother, but out of duty. And you could, thinking back to those selfish genes, you can see how societies created by human beings with selfish genes that wish to survive by having success would create systems of duty, particularly associated with women. So there's strong data on the value of having, why women stay alive for long periods of time after they've stopped breeding. Men, of course, carry on breeding, or they can if they're John Humphreys, through till they're 912. But women stay alive, and the value of grand maternal care can be seen in the data around child survival and child development, because that role, motivated by something which we can't quite understand, has real value in the development of societies and humanity. But we don't really know how to measure it. One of the biggest economic changes over the last 50 years has been the liberation of women from household labour. In that women now spend a lot more time with their children, men spend way more time with their children. There's loads of evidence on actual kind of child development type activities than they did in the 1950s, because before we automated dishwashing and laundry with machines, women spent their time doing housework, and the children mostly brought themselves up. Actually, most developing nations, children do a lot of bringing themselves up. In Bangladesh, when it floods, a lot of children drown simply because they're busy bringing themselves up. And the women are not being mothers, they're being housewives, and they are perhaps gardening, perhaps grinding flour, perhaps cleaning, perhaps creating text, a whole range of different activities, all of which are unpaid because they are kept outside of the formal economy. And this huge shift, all of this labour that women used to do in our developed societies, which they were liberated from, we haven't really studied. And we talk endlessly about productivity, but that productivity gain of the laundry, because we didn't measure it, we can't quantify what's happened to productivity gains of household labour. There are some studies, but it's pretty limited. We spend so much time worrying about the productivity puzzle for formal labour, but actually if you want to create an increase in the amount of activity people do for all of those other things, for the altruistic motivations or relationship motivations, you actually, if you can create productivity gains in those activities, in the care that my mother gave to my grandmother, for example, or cleaning or whatever it might be, but because they are not monetized unless you outsource them, it's hard to create a kind of investable proposition. I'm still kind of trying to work this through, right? Which is why I'm being slightly inarticulate, and also why I've set my voice number, because I feel like at some point I'm going to land on the exact point that I want to make. It's just that we worry most about the stuff we can measure because it's so much easier to worry about and analyse. And yet, most of what human beings spend their lives doing is stuff that is not really measured by those financial metrics, and certainly not by the Treasury. And if we are to try and maximise well-being, we probably need to find ways to measure those things too. And that's why we need to think about this other invisible hand. What motivates people? How do you create productivity gain in the activities that aren't monetised when you can't invest in the things like research and development if it's not monetised? And I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's worthy of a discussion. Which then brings me to this other sort of thought that I have, which is sort of a reaction to the ghastly Dominic Cummings and his blog about how he wants a lot of data scientists working in government. And I don't begrudge him his data scientists. And he was, of course, very sniffy about English literature graduates and their dinner parties. I never have dinner parties because I'm too busy picking up toys off the floor, which I really begrudge. I'm definitely not motivated by altruism. But is that economists, the other thing, if capitalists need communists, right, economists need English literature graduates. And this is not just self-serving. I think listening to Charles talk, I was really struck by, I wanted to just sort of shout, Brexit at him, because I'm afraid some of the story that we're telling, a crisis in a system that isn't working, you have an elite who decide to become a counter-elite. You know, it never strikes me as anything other than absurd that Nigel Farage, the stockbroker, is the sort of populist champion. I had this argument with, who's the dreadful man who used to be chief executive of the CBI, sort of round man. What's his name? He's a lord now. Anyway, he used to be the chief executive. Yes, him. So I was doing a BBC paper review with him, and he said, and I said, he was all like, oh, the bloody elite. And I said, but you're the elite. You're a lord. You were the chief executive of the CBI, which is, you know, anything other than an elite institution. If you think it is, then you're mad. And God, I tried to get him to tell me how much he earned every year, but obviously he wouldn't. But, you know, I mean, I'm sure his salary has 6 figures in it, however he earns his money. The idea that he's not an elite person is ridiculous, but he is he and Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, all these people, they are Aaron Banks, they are a counter-elite, and they have come up with a burning conviction, misguided though I and many others may think it is, that they have the answer if we can only do these things differently, go back to nation states and freewheeling unilateral free trade. Now, I think there is a danger that all of that fervour for change may be dominated by that sudden desire for this is the solution, using up the sense that what might be a green industrial revolution could bring about the sense. So I feel more worried after hearing you talk, so sorry about that. So I gave this talk just before Christmas in Cambridge, and I was talking about the problem with economists and technocrats. And even though I did study English, I sort of feel myself, my happy place actually in designing policy is looking at the evidence and the data and designing some solution involving a spreadsheet. Like, I really like doing that. I like feeling like the clever person in the room who's fixed it. Hey, I run a think tank. Of course I like feeling that I'm clever and I fix the problem. And I have come to terms with the fact that that is not, in fact, the solution that we need. We need to move away from technocratic solutions designed by economists, especially transport economists. I have a real vendetta against them because there were never any nice ones in the Department of Transport. And if you think about infrastructure spending and the way we allocate it, and people talk about that a lot, where I grew up in Wales, voted for Brexit, has had billions of pounds out of the EU for infrastructure. You talk to people, there's endless focus groups, I'm not just making it up, talk to people, you say, but you've had billions of pounds from the European Union, and they say, you didn't ask us what to spend it on. And an economist, especially a transport economist, said, of course we didn't bloody ask you. What we did is we analysed the return on investment to decide which would be the most valuable, and we lined up our projects according to the most high value, and then we went down the list until we'd run out of money. I mean, why would we ask you? You don't know anything about transport economics. You just choose the wrong thing. You probably want to bypass, and you know. So here's the problem. People feel angry about things that have been done to help them. And that's because we focused on our democracy being government for the people instead of government by the people. And I think we have to give more power to people to participate in decisions and accept the fact that they might then make decisions which are, from a sort of pure economics or return on investment perspective, incorrect or imperfect. And that's partly because there is a limit to what we can know, and sometimes we think there are more correct answers rather than probably broadly correct answers than there actually are. We overstate what is the correct investment, certainly in a market economy where everything's unpredictable. But also because, so I think back to this holiday I had with my husband in Bulgaria, which I can't recommend as a skiing destination. We turned up and we managed to ski for one day because the entire place was just a sheet of ice. And the other thing to be said about Borovets, where we went skiing, is that the food in Borovets was like truly abysmal, unbelievably abysmal. At one point we asked, are there any vegetables in this village? And they said, you want vegetables? Go into the city. Anyway, so it was dreadful. So dreadful that this sort of we had full board at the hotel we were staying at. So with the first night we went there, and it had, you know how if you cook spaghetti for too long, it just turns into like a block of spaghetti that you have to cut. That is my first course. Sent my husband back up to the buffet to collect me some pudding, and he brought back a mouldy orange. Like around, it's got a leaf on it, and all around the leaf is this collection of mould. And obviously, I said to him, that is not, that's inedible, I'm not eating that. Marched back up to the counter, looked at all of the array of things, and of course he was correct. This was the best thing available, a mouldy orange. And I reflect on that sometimes because the fact of being involved in the decision enabled me to tolerate a mouldy orange in a way that I couldn't when it was handed down to me by an expert, my husband. Maybe I'm just too much of a feminist. But and I think that is the reality, the experience of enormous numbers of people, is that because they've been excluded from the decision-making process, it's very difficult for them to come to terms with the reality of what's offered. And if fundamentally what we have offered left behind places is that they are 1.5% better off than a counterfactual that they never experienced, of course they're going to be pissed off if they haven't even been involved in the decision-making process. And especially when the counterfactual that they can see is other people doing better than them, whether it's in London or... and that's why, for all of us, we need to have both English literature graduates and, I don't know, other people who are good at talking to people and understanding storytelling as part of the policy-making toolkit, because policy is actually about so much more than spreadsheets. You know, one of the things Charles talks about is the environment, obviously, and it's truly extraordinary to me. People, I'm a like, weird geek about waste policy. No increased understanding was produced in the world about waste policy and how best to manage and reduce our waste footprint as a result of the Blue Planet documentary. And yet the political will and the public will for change and consumer decision making transformed overnight because of an individual story about an individual whale, basically, one piece of footage. And I I've been in a lot of conversations with a lot of policymakers where they laugh at people who say, you think the plural of anecdote is data, and it's not. But the problem is that anecdotes are the way you persuade, anecdotes are the way you involve and engage people, and if we can't master the storytelling of a successful society, then it doesn't matter how many clever spreadsheets we have, we will fail. And that is why Dominic Cummings should hire English literature graduates. But not me, because I've worked in down history and it sucks.
Right, thank you very much, Holly. We've covered quite a lot of ground between the two of you. I'm going to suggest two sort of themes emerging to sort of encourage people to sort of address. One is actually, I think, this interesting issue about fragmentation of elites and Brexit being a fragmentation of elites, and can actually fragmentation of elites actually be in the wrong, in the wrong direction or misled, and actually I'm interested in sort of looking at history in that. The other one was, I suppose, the Dirigist planning, if I got that right, and how you also give power to make decisions, because obviously I think with climate change we're looking at a future which is, not exactly comfortable, where mouldy oranges are likely to be the standard fare that we're going to face. And so if you're planning, if the Dirigist plan is to provide lots of people with mouldy oranges, they're not exactly going to accept them unless they go and find them themselves and realise there's nothing else along it. So
But you are so right, and I'm not sure if this is an area where I disagree with Charles, or not. But so often from climate change activists, you hear basically a sense that we need to override democracy, but it's so important, it needs to happen so fast, and so we just need to charge ahead and do what's right. Boom. First of all, we don't actually know all of the decisions that are correct. There are different ways to approach this. It's not a single solution problem. But also, if you don't involve people, you will get everything from lorry drivers barricading the roads. And do you know what that will do? It will slow you down. So I've got the first thing I wrote in here was Pericles' quote, right? How pretentious is that? Instead of I can't do it in Latin. Instead of looking on discussion as a stumbling block in the way of action, we think it an indispensable preliminary to any wise action at all, right? Like that has to be part of climate change action. Is it has to be participatory, or it will fail and it will be slower.
You don't disagree with me.
Excellent.
But briefly, and then I'm going to open.
But I just wanted to comment on your 2 points very, very quickly. I mean, the fact is that, of course, counter elites can go the wrong way. Look at Germany in the 1930s, so indeed, what I argue in the book is that if people of a progressive turn of mind don't take action, they can't complain when things go the wrong way, because people of the other side have taken action. It's no good complaining about Dominic Cummings and his ilk, or whatever, whoever it is, or Farage, or whoever it is. It's no good if you just let the system drift, and you haven't actually formed these alliances, and haven't actually taken action. That's the point I feel very strongly about. And your point about dirigisme and moldy oranges is of course absolutely right. I mean, we're not in an era of. I mean, dirigisme was Macmillan's phrase, because in those days the gentleman in Whitehall knows best, as Douglas J put it, who's the minister, Navy minister, and that's not the world we live in now. And the problems are more complex than that, and the lorry drivers will barricade. As Polly said, you can't do it anyway, even if you wanted to. So that's why we need the kind of more participative approach to democracy.
Cool.
Surely, the member of the elite who is transforming the system is Mark Carney. We can see through the introduction of environmental social governance with the task force on climate-related financial disclosure under the Financial Stability Board and the incoming reporting that is being required by the regulators on this in 2021. A transformation, a massive transformation of the whole financial system, which, lo and behold, today, Larry Fink, the chief executive of BlackRock, 6.9 trillion asset under management, has signed up to. Isn't this actually making the very change happen in the way that you're describing?
Okay, well, Mark Carney as hero, elite, breaking up is going to change. I think. Can I? Yes.
I can't quite follow that. I can't follow on my point, and that's exactly where I'll come back to in a minute. I found in your talk you missed out a whole decade. You missed out a whole decade, which was 1970. Macmillan was talking in the 60s. In the 70s, you could actually see the elite was self-confident. He took us into Europe. Peter Walker did the 1972 Industry Act, which gave extraordinary powers, more than existed for a very long time, to subsidise the sports sectors, to rescue companies. It needed a socialist, it needed a Labour Party to do that. This was done by the Conservatives. You then saw basically the whole thing which was trying to get people to participate, which is planning agreements, those attempts to do that. If you then look at the sectors that flourished in the 1970s, you see the role of the state in the partnership that your thesis is talking about, very much there. Take Big Pharma. Pharmaceuticals became a very important industry in the 70s. One of the reasons was we used the public policy restraint scheme, the pricing system for the public purchasing of the NHS, to make that industry grow. Companies like Rolls-Royce were rescued by the National Enterprise Board. You wouldn't have that engineering industry. The industrial strategy team, which is hardly talked about these days because it's backing winners, did back winners and it worked. Why do you have a car industry at all in the UK at the moment? It is because they used 1972 Industry Act powers to persuade the Japanese to come here. You had to be going into Europe for that to happen, but it was also the incentives. Why the hell would you put a plant up in the northeast? You can get a large slug of money, which the Industrial Advisory Board gave. So there's a huge amount of things going on. The community did hold together. Read Douglas Wass's book about the borrowings, the IMF borrowings of that period, who was first Federal Secretary of the Treasury. You will find that actually the trade union agreement, which Michael Foot engineered, did actually work. The trade unions did have wage restraint through the mid-70s. And what else was happening in the mid-70s was the government was helping the whole oil industry to grow. It wasn't primarily down to government, that. It was the fact of two things. Your God, who put North Sea oil in the North Sea, and the OPEC, because they put the oil price up twice in big jumps.
But does this find further support Charles's thesis, do you think? Or is
no, I don't think it does. I think first of all, he's missing out a whole decade, which is a decade when the elite was actually self-confident. The elite lost its confidence when we had the window discontent. Mrs. Thatcher came in. She wasn't popular for 2 or 3 years until she won the Falklands War. Let's be clear about that. It wasn't working well. The benefits North Sea oil came and told them they shouldn't do what she did, which is let the exchange rate go everything up, because that actually wiped out the tradable goods sector. What I think I'm saying is, let me try and bring you back to what you're saying. I think it is that there was a self-confident elite in the 70s which thought it knew what it was doing in a world where we were entering a new market. It was then swept away in the 1980s because North Sea oil came in after the 1979 oil price with huge economic rent for the country. Part of the reason for the balance of payments crisis in the 1970s was we were investing in the capital goods to have the North Sea oil. So I think what I'm saying is that the capitalists, there were very few communists around. As far as you want to call Tony Benn a communist, maybe, but it's pushing things a bit to do that. they actually did believe in planning. They believed in dirigism, the whole thing that Learn had been pushing. And that has been swept away, ignored in history. And I think, with respect, sir, I think your thesis doesn't even address the issue, and I think it should do. You're puzzled.
No, I'm just because anyway, Charles, I'll leave you to respond to that and also.
I'll respond to the point about the financial services sector. Of course, Carney's done a great job. The trouble is, I don't think Andrew Bailey is quite in the same mode, is he? Which is a real problem. I mean, it drives things forward.
We've got COP26 coming.
Sorry?
We've got COP26 coming.
We've got COP26
with a massive platform.
What I feel about the, I mean, Larry Fink may have made a great statement, but BlackRock is actually one of the worst performers in the responsible investment field, and despite his statement 2 years ago, actually, he wrote a letter to all the investing company chief executives saying, if you don't behave nicely, we're going to come after you. But actually, he hasn't come after him. So I think
that's a statement today.
No, but I'm talking about what I'm saying is that he's got form, making great statements, but not actually acting on that particular person. So he may make some great statement today, but let's see what that leads to. That's why I say that capitalists need communists, because if they're actually going to take action, they need someone to be saying, hey, Fink, you haven't done what you said you were going to do. And preferably someone who's on his board who can say, Fink, you haven't said what you're going to do. You're
That's
going to
the
get
Climate
fired.
100 group.
Sorry?
That's the Climate 100 group with 33 trillion. He's joined in with that group.
Yes.
So there's
That's
a surrogate board there.
Some of the big asset managers are actually going in the right direction, and are actually driving things forward. And maybe he's following, but what I'm saying is they need people to push them. And as far as the 70s is concerned, I'm not sufficiently expert on the field. I recognise what you're saying, but I'm not sufficiently expert on the field to respond to that. That's how I meant.
So I have a point on sort of both things really. I agree with you that there is substantial hope. You know, that we don't need to completely despair.
No.
We don't know how this government will approach things, and it sort of linked to this thought about the 70s. And I was grateful for your input on the 70s. I confessed having been born in 1980, so my knowledge of the 70s is, and also I'm crap at studying history. So that was really helpful. But what's fascinating to me is that activist government has been a feature of lots of government in industry, and it's very easily sort of attacked, and obviously it went very much out of favour in the Thatcherism era. But from 2010, certainly, Vince Cable had an industrial strategy, which was about picking winners, and David Cameron had an industrial strategy, and Sajid Javid sort of wouldn't talk about it like that, but of course the policies and the grand challenges are all still there. And remain, and Boris Johnson is now talking even more about industrial strategy, and actively trying to do some of the things that your quote sort of mentioned, of trying to work out where growth should be and decide what the hell are we going to do about poor old Burnley. And the Conservative Party has a truly remarkable knack for doing radical things and describing them as if they're moderate. It's very impressive, because the Labour Party, of course, does the exact opposite and takes really quite reasonable, sensible ideas and talks about them as radical. We've done a report at Demos on the Preston model, and we had this fascinating event at the Labour Party conference talking about it. Yvette Cooper was there, one of the people involved in setting up the Preston model, and a couple of other sort of left-wing commentators to discuss this idea of basically just really aggressive local procurement policy. And the people who were advocating for it described this as having reinvented the very principles of capitalism. And I sort of thought, no, you haven't. You've just got sort of social value in procurement policy dialed up to 11. And it's quite good, but you haven't reinvented capitalism. You've still got people buying stuff from other people and negotiating, and all of the basic architecture of capitalism is still there. You're just doing something different. It was truly extraordinary. And then a Conservative councillor, I'm not really sure why he was there, sort of put his hand up from the audience, from somewhere, like Wiltshire or somewhere, very kind of true blue Tory, and said, this sounds excellent. I think this is exactly what we're trying to do in Wiltshire in order to develop the local cheese industry through procurement. You just thought, to the Tories, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's just talk about it. Reasonable, nothing to see here, don't panic. And the Labour Party just does this madness of trying to scare people into thinking that everything's going to change when all you're really talking about is, buying local cheese. And that's why they always bloody lose.
Yes.
Hi, I just had two kind of briefer, more direct questions. I was wondering how you would implement your kind of informal social cooperation between capitalists and communists in other countries like America, for instance, where the political window is so much further to the right, and any discussion of far left policy is considered far more radical, and that kind of solidarity that you're talking about on a widespread local scale is so much harder to implement and advocate and take to the major change levels that you're talking about. And I also wanted to ask you briefly talked about climate change and how the movements like Extinction Rebellion are too fast to sweep aside the processes of democracy and kind of rush towards rapid action in response to a
I wasn't they're actually they're arguing for a citizens' assembly.
But pointing out that I was wondering what you would raise in defence of that, in addressing climate change is really a rapidly advancing problem, and given the failure of mainstream institutions to act in the rapid level that we need to, what your kind of non-populist, pro-democratic, process-abiding solution would be, just from one English literature student to another.
Well, so I simply think it sounds like it will be faster, but it will be slower. A completely different example. When I first took over Demos, I decided that I needed, this is between us obviously, a new board of trustees. And so I came up with the people who should be on the board of trustees, and I put it to my existing board of trustees and said, let's do this. And they just flipped out, like, how dare you do this? You're the chief executive, this is not your right. And they freaked out. It's taken me 18 months. I've got every single one of those people appointed to the board. And of course, if I'd consulted them and been played nice, I could have probably got it done in 2 or 3 months. It needs to happen now. Feels like it's the answer to speed, but it is not the answer to speed. It is the answer to protest and fury. And fundamentally, with climate change, we need people to behave differently. And if you want people to behave differently, you have to talk to the people about the different behaviours that they're going to need to exhibit. It's just a fundamental misconception that it is faster to do it by diktat, unless you are proposing literally the abolition of, democracy, and you're planning to do it Gosplan style or Glorious Revolution style, or Cultural Revolution. Getting the Glorious Revolution, which was all right.
I think it's exaggeration. But there have been many cases in history, not particularly British history, but just generally, where democracy has been preserved, but the elite has joined forces to basically choice edit, if you like, the choices available to the public. So that they gauge actually, I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing, I'm just saying it's a historical phenomenon, so that they gauge actually have the option of choosing, say, not responding to climate change in a radical way. They have choices about how to do it, but those choices are limited. So I think that it's not a pure, it's not a case of either democracy or not democracy. It's a question of the extent to which those people who want to deal with climate change perhaps limit or reduce the quantity of choice open to Just coming to your point about, I'm not an expert on America, but I'm one specific point and 2 general points. I mean, there will be parts of the elite in America which are more sympathetic to the progressive agenda, obviously. So obviously. It's the people in Occupy or whatever who can put pressure on those people who can then themselves put pressure on the system in other ways. So if there are some asset managers in New York who are really taking this climate change or inequality or whatever, then they can be spurred to action by the outsiders. You've got the big public sector. I mean, CalPERS is always quoted as the great help for everybody because it's the big public sector. Big public sector pension fund in California, and then there's the teachers' pension fund in California. These are potentially have had a lot of influence potentially have even more influence. And so this is a channel for outsiders, rather than just sort of banging on, Michigan State Senate or whatever. That's not really the approach.
But there you have a pension fund actually instrumental in the change. CalPERS. It was
Yes,
the
I'm saying
first
yes,
to
exactly.
introduce
Yeah.
green finance in
Yes.
America.
Yes, exactly.
That's shifted the terminology completely.
Yes. Yes. No, I agree. And I mean, they've done. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope that this can go on. I think this process is we've got a half-open door here, which is why it's worth talking about. It's not fully open yet, so it's still worth pushing.
Thank you. I wanted to say something about whales and plastic.
Oh yeah. Which
So-
kind of whales? Because I talked about both.
Yeah, no, I meant the cetaceans.
Okay.
But I particularly enjoyed the way in the front half of your remarks you were willing, and it doesn't happen often enough in my experience, to think out loud without being certain what the answer is. Because I think that is part of the dialogue processes that need to go on here. So it's not just a case of we, the elite, coming down from our mountain to speak with the great unwashed or those who have been shut
You
up.
look like you've washed.
On this occasion.
Great. Well, thank you for doing that.
But I think that there's an humility that needs to come from kind of our side of the discussion, because I think we do have to acknowledge that we in this room are part of that elite. Most of us, I suspect. But the particular point I wanted to make about the whales and the plastics, I think connects two things that you were saying, which is its tangibility. That suddenly, and it's a bit like recycling, that recycling was supposed to be hard, but it's actually quite easy because it's there, you can see it, you can touch the bloody stuff. There's one bin or another bin. The reason that the scene in Blue Panic was so successful was a very visceral one, and connects to what you've been talking about, stories, because I'm sitting there on my sofa watching this poor dolphin with his bit of plastic on it, and I'm holding some plastic. I can connect to that story very viscerally. The problem with climate change is it's so diffuse, actually, and I think the anger that needs to feed in somewhere in your sort of processes of change has to be a bodily or incorporated or physical one, not just an intellectual one. I think there's something, physical, bodily, that has to be involved in this somehow, and I still don't quite get what that is or how it works, but the kind of changes I've seen qua the environment over the last 10, 15, 20 years have all had that kind of physical link, and I think that just needs to be in the mix.
If you were in the Australian wildfire, you would see it.
Absolutely.
It's not a matter of...
Yeah, there's no avoiding.
Or in Bangladesh, or in Florida,
Jakarta.
But if I want to tell us a story about how I'm going to change my life
tangible
in the future
in changing
to
weather
get to net
systems.
zero, I don't think it's enough. Still, Australia's still too far away. Somehow, I can't. The story's necessary, but even that's not quite enough.
What more?
Yes, it's truly extraordinary. So one of our colleagues is Australian, and she went home for her grandmother's funeral, only to then get caught up in the bushfires, and they do this backburn where basically they burn towards the fires to clear a space before the fires approach, so that the fires can't leap to the houses and destroy property. But obviously you're like literally setting a fire to stop a fire. It's very terrifying. And she came back with charred eucalyptus leaves to show us, and she talked about how the warning sign is when the smoke is yellow or brown, rather than if it's white smoke, it's fine. People walking this picture of firefighters in what looks like heavy fog in terms of that level of fog, and she's like, no, that level of smoke's fine, it is white. And it just kind of changes how quickly those things become normalised and common knowledge. And yet what's extraordinary is that the conversation about climate change hasn't shifted as dramatically as you would think it would in Australia. And that's partly because there is new bits of disinformation that are seeded. And of course those it is the disinformation warfare is fueled by lots of people who understand the power of storytelling, because people don't want it to be true. They don't want that level of change, because change is kind of seems neurobiologically, as it were, to be quite hard for us to process. And the idea that it might all have been driven by arson is being seeded and propagated, and then amplified by idiot influencers like, I don't know, James Dellingpole or whoever it might be. So I'm just carrying on being humble. What a humble brag. But I think you're exactly right that trying to work out what the successful storytelling is about people. I used to write speeches for Nick Clegg, actually, and I remember once we were trying to talk about the party's new great commitment on climate change, and it was that it was more than 10 years ago now, so it was where the party had sort of committed to trying to keep climate change below 2 degrees. And it was like, this is so boring. To below 2 degrees, what does that mean? And, he's a clever guy, right? You can present him with the science and he can process the fact that, okay, I understand that this is super important. And Liberal Democrat conference delegates are such uber geeks that, of course, he got this outbreak of applause. And it was so, you see politicians give speeches and you can tell the kind of applause lines, and they get to the habit of recognising and waiting for the applause, and the applause comes in, and they manage that very successfully. With this, Nick was so convinced that he was not going to get an applause line for this tedious 2 degrees thing, and it interrupted his flow, and he was like taken aback, and the audience, and then it was on their feet, like standing ovation, 2 degrees. But that is weirdos, right? Like the kind of people who give up probably £1,000 of their money for the whole thing and spend 4 days by the seaside discussing Liberal Democrat policy motions. Nobody else has any sense of, I'm going to limit, what? It has to be about the visceral realities of, and I don't know how we make people feel sufficiently frightened without something new in our armoury.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is Britain is not going to be the place you talk about Britain, it's not going to be the place that suffers first and worst. So
Floods, we've got floods.
Sorry?
We've got floods, but the Maldives is literally drowning.
Other places are going to have a much worse time. So it's quite difficult. It's very difficult if you're going to rely on that.
But America, actually, what's interesting about America, having just arrived back from there, is that they do have disasters on a scale that we can't really imagine, don't they? So maybe, ironically, actually, America could be a lot more effective. I mean, like Australia, to some extent, Australia may feel closer to them.
But I mean, not to fit in, but America and Australia both have this odd phenomenon where they both have conservative, or in America's case, more kind of populist conservative prime ministers or presidents who are vehemently denying, or at least have very complicated relationships with climate narratives, even though they're ideally placed to propagate that kind of radical change that you're talking about. So it's this odd, it's almost like one feeds off the other. You have these kind of radical events that inspire existential doom, and in response people elect figures that deny that doom in an act of, catharsis, perhaps, denial. So, you need figures who recognise it for what it is, and those figures annoyingly seem to exist largely outside the countries where these crises are happening.
Yeah, who would choose an inconvenient truth over convenient fiction?
Yeah. And that is actually interesting. That is one of the standard structures of Hollywood movies, where disaster happens, the hero first tries to do the easiest thing to address it, because that fails, and then they sort of they ratchet up, and then at one point they go into hero mode when they sort of move to a level of action, but they have to go through a number of failures of trying the easy way before they rise up to true hero mode and win the day, sort of thing.
I don't think, I don't know, because I haven't looked at the data, I'm sorry. I haven't looked at the data, but I suspect, on the basis of a few doorstep conversations, that people with young children are more concerned about climate change than older people are. And what this makes me feel is
That's almost certainly true.
The way you address this is not, and this is an old thing, lots of people have said, I'm saying it's terribly original. The way you address this is you link action on climate change to this sort of positive green industrial revolution, etc., etc. You don't try and scare people with stories about, sort of viscerally frightening stories. And this is where I'm afraid that you get a bit of sort of manipulation, if you like, by the elite in the way that I was just talking about, where they sort of agree to agree on this, and they just say, well, this is the line, we're going to push forward this idea that we need a green industrial revolution, and we're all going to agree, because we can't have a green industrial revolution for 4 years and then put it into reverse. And that doesn't, and that seems to me a reasonably possible scenario, whereas I think trying to frighten everybody into radically changing their lifestyles is not actually ever going to happen.
So I think that's right. I just think you can get more done if you can harness market forces and consumer choices in the right direction. And plastic packaging is a really interesting area where, so I was speaking to a drinks industry guy who says that for the last 30 years, packaging just hasn't really mattered. And so every time you needed to sort of satisfy your boss by getting another % margin, you'd just call up the packaging guys and say, sorry, we're reducing the price we pay for our bottles. And so there's been, 30 years of just no R&D in the packaging industry because their margins are constantly being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed by the kind of the purchasers of their product. And so you now get this situation where there's been quite a radical shift in what consumers want, but the adaptations needed to the packaging industry are vast. And in terms of R&D or the fundamental science of composting plastics, we're just way behind what we could have been. It seems to me that if something's happened that shifts consumer demand, a really proactive industrial strategy can get in behind that and say, okay, how do we invest in the right kinds of plant and machinery, the right kinds of science, the right kinds of broader R&D, so that you take that consumer shift and you push and push and push and push and push it, and you enable it, rather than what at the moment, which is that the packaging industry is still talking about 3 more years to get rid of black plastic.
That's one part of the story. You can't rely on consumer demand shifts brought about by some sort of propaganda campaign. You can't rely on that.
No, but neither can you rely on people not to protest if you close down their coal-fired power station with, 2 minutes' notice.
Yes, well, absolutely.
Or double the price of petrol.
You don't do it with 2 minutes' notice. You do it with plenty of time.
I do promise people an end at 8:30. We've already lost 2. Obviously, planned their dinner maybe at 8:30 to end that. So I can see that this is a sort of ongoing discussion, so I'm probably not going to ask you to summarise.
Oh, God.
So I think we go for the humility that I think we've had lots of interesting, I think always find looking at history incredibly sort of helps you think through these things, and especially we've got a good also edition of 70s history, which is, I think, a lost decade, and I think that's been great. And trying to explore these issues, I will keep the mouldy orange as a sort of great metaphor. I think, how do you get people to eat mouldy oranges? And thinking about the elite, I think, has really been useful, and how that fragments in different ways, and can be maybe part of the solution. So I think we've had lots of really good ideas and input to think through these really fundamental challenges we face. And I hope over this year we're going to cover more of this climate change challenges, and trying to get different perspectives and different ways. I think particularly as we're obviously hosting COP26. So I do hope you will come back and partake in future discussions. And we have wine now and snacks. Q cold wine in fridge downstairs, or have you got it already? Brilliant, thank you very much. Bring the screw top first. Sorry. And also Charles has some books on hand, ready to delve deeper into the history and examples and so on, to put even more flesh on the bones that we've managed to cover in a relatively short period. So I'd just like us all to thank very much Charles and Polly for giving us lots of inspiration, interesting ideas, things for us to chew on, or suck that orange. Thanks very much.